You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record, for the benefit of his grandson and my son, Ben the Bear. Of course, we all know that there are so many great Star Trek fans out there, so we're putting these up for free on YouTube for everyone to enjoy. Today we are going to be reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation episode 21 from season 1, Symbiosis. And first, Jake, how are you, and what did you think of this episode?
I'm good, Jay. Thank you. And I think they're, this is since the first time I've really reviewed a television series. I'm just really impressed by looking at what the writers do from week to week during the course of the season, how much work this is, how much imagination puts into it. And I think it's just another good story. And since this was aired on April 18th of 1988, it was at the very tail end of the Reagan administration. And of course, there's a big, drug abuse theme here, which was a big deal during the Reagan administration, the drug war, and Nancy Reagan's campaign to just say no, et cetera, et cetera. So, and obviously it has very interesting, social and economic points, the relationship between these two worlds.
Yeah, I think those are spot on. I think one thing about the show that I'm really appreciating as we go through this first season, reviewing it together, is how contemporary these stories remain, decades after they've been aired. This story, Symbiosis, could be told today, which says something both great about the show in terms of its foresight and how evergreen, quote unquote, it's able to stay, which is why I think Star Trek The Next Generation remains popular. And, really all the Star Trek shows, they really do have messages that last forever and stories that can last forever and still be applicable to anyone at any time. I think this episode is interesting because on one hand, I think, you're right to point out the Reagan administration, especially Nancy Reagan's push on the war on drugs. But the other hand, I think this episode actually does a very good job in terms of being pretty objective about drug use. It's not necessarily... I don't think it necessarily depicts drugs as bad. And, just to jump into this, we'll kind of be jumping around here, but There's a conversation kind of in the middle of the episode between Wesley, Yarn, Data, where they really talk about, Wesley is basically saying, I don't understand how anyone could become chemically dependent on a drug.
Right.
And Tasha, using her experience from her home world, where, as everyone knows, she was subject to extreme poverty and violence, had to hide from roving rape gangs, revealed that she herself was once a drug addict, because when you're in such a depressive, devastating setting, and that infects so much of your day-to-day existence, drugs are an easy and pleasurable escape from the despair you're feeling.
Right.
And I thought that was a very mature explanation to why people take drugs without actually being damning about it.
It was very concise and succinct also. Yeah.
And it was very interesting that, Wesley, even after that explains, after it's explained to him by Yar, he's like, well, I guess I just don't understand. She's like, well, I hope you never have to.
Because he was not in a situation, an environment where he would be, tempted, or it would be available to him and so on. Right.
Well, it's also, I think, kind of reflective of the future where, he's grown, from Wesley's perspective, he's growing up in the Federation, which is this post-scarcity society where they don't have any real worries about economic degradation, societal decay. It doesn't seem like anyone's really worried about, having violence brought upon them in terms of their day-to-day existence. It makes sense that Wesley would never understand why people would start using drugs, because he's literally in a civilization that has done away with the reason for you to do drugs.
Just thinking the one point they maybe didn't touch on was when you have, and just looking at what happens in, poor neighborhoods in cities and in the country, in this country right now, is there's a financial or economic motivation for people to get into drugs, because if they don't have any jobs, it's a source of income for some people. Yeah. They really didn't touch on that, but they could have easily blended that in.
So, without dovetailing too much, even though, what, we should talk about criminality in this because we're going to talk about the Breckians. I am truly of the belief, and there's a good body of research that, pans this out. You wouldn't have crime, at least not on the scale that we see it, if people didn't have to resort to it. Because like you just said, most people resort to crime because it is often their only economic means. Maybe it's because they are suffering from some sort of personal or developmental defect that makes it hard for them to integrate in normal society. Often a lot of people are placed in desperate situations where they feel like they have no choice but to commit a crime. I think when we talk about crime, and even when we talk about drug use, we assume that everyone committing a crime or doing drugs or just taking part in what we would consider immoral or ethical actions are doing it because they're evil or that there's something deficient in them. And most of the time, that's not the issue at all. They've just been put into such an extreme situation that their only reaction is to react in such a extreme way, or, as Yar rightfully points it out, numb yourself out so you don't have to feel it. I think that there is a certain level of compassion in this episode, though at the same time, like, it's balanced with Picard's practicalism, or his practicality, especially when it comes to the Prime Directive, which we'll definitely get into. But I think this episode, especially with Yar's speech with Wesley, really does point out that, like, I don't think this show was trying to, like, promote Reaganism or promote the Reagan view. I think because, as we know, Gene Roddenberry was a terrible drug addict, so he was still producing the show when this aired. So it would be very interesting for Gene Roddenberry to come out and say, no, don't do drugs, when
right. Yes,
it was a well-known thing that Gene had a lot of addictions, and that many of them contributed to his death. So, I think on one hand, this episode does a good job, but I think in certain places it does a disservice, because I don't think that this episode is as much about drugs and addiction as it is the marketplace that is built around drugs and addiction. Like the Breckians, taking this from street level crime to what I think is actual crime, the Breckians are no different from many of the pharmacological companies or the big pharma companies here in the United States and the world over. Especially when I think it was Purdue that produced OxyContin.
Yes.
Purdue is basically the Breckians.
Yes.
And most of them are, and the Anarans are the Americans who got hooked on OxyContin and other
right
opioids. So I think this episode really does kind of reflect something that I don't know. What was the conversation like in 1988 about big pharma and their participation in terms of how they changed society, bringing drugs to the market? Because just for everyone to understand, OxyContin didn't show up until the 90s.
Yeah, back in 1988, I don't think there was much. There was concern about the cost of pharmaceuticals, prescription medicines. There were just starting to be, concerns about, the cost and so on. But, it was before the time that you had direct advertising of drugs like we have now on commercial television and so on, which is, from what I understand, we're the only country that does that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're easily the only country that openly installs a profit motive when it comes to dealing pharmaceuticals to our populace.
Right.
In many ways, the way that we've allowed pharmacies in this country, and I know this seems like we're getting away from the episode, but we're actually waist deep into the episode now. It seems to me in this country, just like the Breckians, there's this kind of casual disregard for the suffering of the customer. Because even if you look at this from a capitalist perspective of, I'm producing this medicine, I'm producing a product that you need to pay me for it so you can use it, there is a huge difference in terms of what the Breckians, and maybe, in a real world example, like a company that Purdue, a pharma company like Purdue committed. They're taking part in this action that is knowingly dehumanizing and degrading, and they're knowingly making money off of it, even to the point that they're kind of sneering at the Anarans because they know sorry, go on.
I think that, like Purdue, if you use that example with the opioids, OxyContin and so forth, it's enough information to come out about their sales tactics where they really identified those physicians who were really been convinced to prescribe that opioid drug as a panacea for any type of pain. And they just, gave them incentives and they really pushed it. Purdue is family owned. I don't think it's publicly traded. So it's a little different from Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline and so on. And, in some ways, I guess we could, I don't know if we want to go there, but we also talk about how, is there a parallel just in terms of the market aspect of the Latin American or Mexican drug cartels?
Oh, absolutely.
Providing cocaine, particularly cocaine and weed and so forth, and other things now, ecstasy and, the fake marijuana, fake, THC and so forth. But the interesting thing, when you talk about the market aspect of the pharmaceutical industry, for those that are publicly traded, I think they've got a tough job in that, they do have to make money. They do have a responsibility to their shareholders. They do have to have, a lot of money for research and development. At the same time, they play a lot of tricks, like they'll have a drug that has been on the market long enough that it's going to lose its patent protection. so that it's going to go generic, and they know they're going to take a big hit in their revenue stream. So they'll change the molecular structure of a drug enough so they can get new intellectual property on it, send it through, clinical trials so it gets FDA approved or, EMA approved in Europe or, Japan or wherever. And then they can, extend the life basically of the drug. So, but it's really, and then you've got the regulatory issue to deal with, which is tougher in some countries than others. They have the issue of, one thing that's really concerning this country, they know that they can get reimbursed more for a drug in the US healthcare system they can from Canada or Europe. Mm-hmm. And, they don't even, in many cases, want to deal with providing drugs to third world countries and so forth, but they do that because they have some social responsibility and so on. So, and I think just to finish my comments, I think part of healthcare reform we have to do is figure out how we can, stop prices rising, the cost of pharmaceuticals increasing, but at the same time, balance and be fair to the capitalistic character of the publicly owned pharmaceutical companies, because they do some important work, as shown by what's happened, what Pfizer did and Moderna and so forth with these vaccines.
I think you brought up some incredibly important points, especially when it comes to, despite the criticisms that can be laid at the feet of capitalism, and there are many that are justly deserved, it's only been in a capitalist system that pharmaceutical companies are able to pursue these kind of innovations. And you're right, there is an aspect to the big pharmaceutical companies that does push innovation forward and does ultimately create things that will help patients. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest problem that we have, and you kind of mentioned it, they have to share their shareholders. And I think one of the problems with, and you kind of mentioned it with the Purdue family in terms of them being a privately owned company.
Yeah, they didn't have the same social responsibility,
Which kind of makes what they did worse.
It does, yeah.
Because behind closed doors and backstage, they all know what's going on. Mm-hmm. Versus, I think, there's this. Well, I have it here. Let me move some stuff at home, people. My office is kind of in a disarray at the moment, but there's this great book by Anand Giridharadas named Winners Take All. It's kind of backwards, but it's called Winners Take All, and it's the elite charade of changing the world. And it talks a lot about how, shareholders are geared to only expect a return on their investment. That's what they invest. They expect there to be a return. In many ways, they don't have to show any social responsibility because that's not their function in there. The social responsibility is usually set by the company, whether it's the CEO or
the board.
The board.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to reforming big pharma so it's not as harmful and as predatory as it is now, I'm a real big believer that when it comes to the medical industry, maybe there shouldn't be shareholders a little bit, or maybe there should be a reconsideration of the rules and powers that shareholders are given to make decisions when it comes to corporate oversight and governance. Because it seems as though a lot of these shareholders are so hands-off that a lot of them don't even know what's going on until it's been reported. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, I think you're right. There is this need that we have to maintain an open marketplace so new drugs can come to the market and patients can see the benefit of them. But unless we change the incentive structure for bringing these drugs to market, I don't think we're going to change anything. Like, the incentive should actually be to make better drugs that help more people on a wider scale. Like these vaccines. These vaccines really are miraculous in a way.
Mm-hmm.
These pharmaceutical companies should really be more pushing towards research and development. I'm a big believer that if you're going to have a successful company, you put more of your time into research and development than you do marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't matter how much marketing you do. If you have a shit product, it's a shit product. And the product is ultimately going to speak for itself. It's just clear to me when I look at the pharmacological milieu that's out there. When we watch these commercials that come on trying to sell us everything from heart medication to dick pills.
And cancer drugs. A lot of cancer drugs. Yeah.
One thing that I have noticed, and I started really watching this in middle school because I started noticing these commercials, the amount of side effects that a lot of these drugs have increased exponentially, it seems.
No, I don't know. I think they've always been there. And I've had some doctors say, look, just take what I prescribe to you. If you read the package insert with all the side effects, you wouldn't take it, period.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think as we push forward into new frontiers of medicine, in some ways, I think pharmacology may not go away, but it may transform into something very different, and something I think that looks a lot more like Star Trek.
Well, and we touched on this before, is that it's medicine's changing, where, particularly with understanding genetic sequencing of individuals, that we're going to move away from, we've already got, biologic drugs, but the other thing is that's happening with some pharmaceutical companies, they're actually getting into gene therapy, and the regulatory pathway is a little different for a gene therapy versus a classic, drug, molecule that has a therapeutic action and benefit. And then the other thing, which will be regulated a little differently, is cellular therapy also. And there's some pharmaceutical companies that are, buying larger companies are buying smaller companies because they want to get into that sphere. They want to enter that market and so on. So,
yeah.
And, there's whole issues related to, well, how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? Because, for instance, there's one, the first FDA approved gene therapy was for a condition of blindness called Leber's congenital amaurosis, and it's one single dose, but and I don't know whether the cost has dropped, but one dose, and that's all you can really give the patient, because it's supposed to be a one-shot hit to change their genetic sequence, is $800,000.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. Now this drug is sort of an orphan drug. It's not, there's not the prevalence of this particular disease is not that high. But, if you come up for, a gene therapy for something like sickle cell disease, which affects a lot of people around the world, then, how much is it going to cost? Can the healthcare system afford it? I mean, one good example, I don't know what the economics are, the cost benefit ratio, but you have these good drugs now that can eliminate, they're antivirals that can eliminate hepatitis C from patients. I don't know what they cost now, but a couple of years ago when they first came out, when they were FDA approved, one 8-week, 10-week, whatever it is, regimen of this drug so that you knock the hep C virus out of your system, $60,000. How much do AIDS drugs cost now? I don't think they cost that much. they're not cheap, but they're not outrageously expensive.
Well, there was also the innovation of I think it's called PrEP, which helps suppress the HIV cell count.
Yeah, that's one of the drugs, sure. Yeah.
And I think PrEP was made relatively cheap because here in New York, for the LGBTQ community, it's pretty widely available.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that when it came to drugs like that, so I think places like New York saw a need and they worked to make that freely available. I think when you mentioned something like the $800,000 shot, or how much was the Hep C drug again?
I think it was 60,000, what I had read.
One thing that we don't talk about when it comes to medicine is how much people really are locked out of treatment due to class, because a lot of the price tag of those drugs that you mentioned, unless you had some sort of insurance that could defray some of the costs,
right,
you have to be extremely wealthy to even access them,
right,
and access them on a regular basis to maintain your level of health. So I feel like we've been talking a lot about this.
Well, what I wanted to kind of shift to, it kind of gets into the whole economics is, it's understandable how this symbiotic relationship formed between the Breckians, because they had the plant that grew on their planet that produced the drug that they used, that the Anarans used to treat what they thought was a plague. And originally it was a plague.
Mm-hmm.
And but it seemed, so I wonder, one of the thoughts I've had is, if the Breckians basically don't do anything, the only productive work that they do, their economy is totally based on production of the drug to feed to the Anarans. And in turn, the Anarans produce all the goods and raw materials that the Breckians need. At one point, did the Breckians produce things so they were self-sufficient, self-sustaining? I mean, that's a very interesting, because I don't think there's any time frame put onto when the plague actually showed up on Onara. It's kind of like, how long did it take to this symbiotic relationship to develop, and so on? And
how would the plague have spread from Breccia to Rebecca to Onara?
And then at what point did the Breckians understand that they were really taking advantage of the Onarans, but they could take advantage of the Onarans because they had a productive society and were producing goods and services, but particularly goods that could sustain their way of life. When they said, we could be, they weren't fat, dumb, and happy, but they were dumb and happy for sure, that we can just not do any work except grow these plants. It sounds like they even had the Onarans providing the freighters that would take goods to Breccia and then bring the drug back, because again, the Onarans were so desperate for the drug.
So, my one big criticism of this episode is that kind of the world building around the Onarans and the Breckians is very deficient, because you bring up a lot of really good points. Let's frame the episode real quick for those at home who aren't familiar with it, because we've been talking a lot about things that aren't necessarily connected, but we'll connect it here. So the USS Enterprise D is investigating unusual solar flares and magnetic activity in the Delos system. While looking at one of these solar eruptions, which, Riker and Picard are kind of in awe of, because the Enterprise is first going very close to an active star, they receive a distress signal from the Onaran freighter Sanction orbiting the fourth planet of the system. Immediately, they go and try to help the Onarans, and are immediately kind of stunned by the complete incompetence
That's
of the
right.
people that they're rescuing. And in the process of trying to rescue the Anarans, the Anaran ship freighter explodes, and they try to beam the 6 crew members aboard. Unfortunately, they only get 4, and the four crew members that are beamed aboard are 2 Breckians and 2 Anarans. The Anarans, named Tajan and Romus, are there to get the drug known as Felicium, and the Breckians, Sobi and Langor, are there to deal it for them. Mm-hmm. There's an immediate disagreement because it seems that Tajor and Romus paid Sobi and Langor, but because the freighter was destroyed, along with what I essentially think is probably the Breckians' form of payment, Sobi and Langor are refusing to turn over the Felicium to John and Romus, who warn Picard and the rest of the crew that if we don't get this Felicium, a disease that is ravaging our homeworld of Renara is going to end with everyone being dead.
Right.
So, kind of bringing us up to the episode. One thing that they kind of laid out early on when they were talking about these 2 planets in the background, both were on the verge of space travel. Yet, mm-hmm. as you pointed out, how do they keep those freighters flying if they were so incompetent through all those years? And further, it's never established whether or not Picard is dealing with an actual warp-capable race.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned this before, that the Enterprise is interacting with worlds and peoples that are capable of space travel, but they're still pre-warp.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you used the term world building, because there really is some, I mean, again, the story's there, it's a decent story and so forth, but when you think about how did these worlds come to be the way they are, and how do they end up in this symbiotic relationship, and the fact that the Onarans are so incompetent in terms of maintaining these freighters, it's like, did they even build them? Or did they buy them from someone, or and they didn't give them the owner's manual and spare parts, that sort of thing. It is a weakness in the world building.
One thing that you pointed out in the notes that we use for the show is that Anaran medicine is very limited, if not incompetent, and that they could not figure out that they were not dealing with a plague, but a long-term chemical addiction.
Right.
I find it interesting that if the Anarans are so incompetent because they're so strung out all the time because of this drug, how do they actually get to work to make the things that they need to pay the Breckians off for the Felicium?
That's a very good point too. Yeah.
It seems to me like, and the way it's depicted, not only with Tajan and Romus, but I forget the name of the leader of Anara, mm-hmm. Margan.
Right.
Who's actually, there's actually a lot of really good actors in this in this show. Kenneth Tygar played Margan. He's been in a bunch of shows, but one person I want to highlight for a second is Merritt Bucktrick, who plays Tajan. Merritt Bucktrick actually played David Marcus, Jim Kirk's son.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that, right?
In Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. Mm-hmm. He's the one that Christopher Lloyd's character, I think,
kills.
Chang?
Yeah.
No, Chang was Star Trek
Christopher
6.
Plummer. Yeah.
But I just wanted to highlight because he's kind of an important character in Star Trek lore, but also, we mentioned PrEP and HIV/AIDS. Merritt Bucktrick, unfortunately, was one of the first stars of the AIDS HIV era in the 80s and early 90s to actually die from the disease. He actually died from complications of the virus in 1991. So just wanted to mention that here. You know, I on one hand, you know, you pointed out that the economic relationship with these two worlds is very much slavery. Like, the Brecons have enslaved the Anarans as their general labor force. But I just don't understand how they're getting any work done if they can't even keep their freighters running. And they even say, like, the Sanction was their only working freighter. They have two more, apparently on Onara, that just aren't running because they don't know how to.
Well, then these magnetic maybe when they had when they had three working freighters, there was enough flow of goods back and forth, and particularly Felicium coming back from Breccia, that it would, you know, satisfy the cravings, the drug needs of the Onarans, so that, you know, production wasn't stifled. But maybe what happened is that they did not have the capability to keep the fleet of freighters going. They went down to one, and even that was having problems. Then that's where they got into a critical situation where they just totally were running out of Felicium. Everybody on Onara is experiencing acute withdrawal.
Oh, one thing that I do want to point out in all this, since you brought up, you know, everyone on Onara, they make it very clear that the population of that world is only in the thousands. And it's the same thing in Breccia. Like, these aren't worlds full of like millions or billions of people like we have here on Earth. One interesting thing I find about some Star Trek episodes is that when they go to these new worlds that they find people populated, and they're never really big populations. Sometimes they really are like, you know, tens of thousands.
Well, I didn't catch the number of people on the two planets, but it sort of makes sense because, you know, since they had this sort of static symbiotic relationship and there was limited, you know, need for goods back and forth. I mean, you know, Breccia had one export to Onara, and we don't know what kind of foodstuffs or materials the Onarans grew or manufactured and sent over to Breccia. But that kind of very tight, you know, directed, limited, again, symbiotic relationship would not really catalyze, you know, economic growth, and thus your population probably would stay small and so on.
Well, ultimately, too, I think it would reach a point where, you know, the real danger of drugs is that as you take them, you form a tolerance to them. You know, they kept one thing that they talked about when they first introduced the Felicium, which has a very interesting mechanism. You know, it's this little seed that they pull out, and then they load it into this kind of, I guess it's some sort of crucible or some sort of chamber that converts the drug and places it in kind of a device that you can inject it yourself with.
Right.
You know, at some point, I just don't get how the Brecons and Onarans make it this far. Because even if their population stays low, because, you know, they're all kind of stuck in this relationship, at some point, you know, there's going to be a situation like this where the Enterprise didn't show up. And I'm surprised that it didn't already happen before the Enterprise showed up in some ways. Like, I just don't see how a society doesn't fall apart quickly.
Well, you bring up a good point. It just fits into.
And did they have any other trading partners? Like,
none are mentioned, but it fits into the story. And part of it is that the point you just brought up, that it seemed like the relationship was going to collapse.
Yeah.
And that it was very serendipitous or providential that the Enterprise showed up and that they could figure out what was going on. And then, you know, Picard come up with a Solomaic type solution that was going to be tough for both worlds. But, you know, he came up with a solution where he could comply with the Prime Directive and get them to have to do things differently.
I think his And you use the word Salmonaic solution is interesting because it really kind of gets into the philosophy of the Prime Directive, because here I actually have the quote that Picard tells Crusher in the turbo lift after the Breckians and the Urnarans have been beamed off. He actually kind of stops the lift because he and Crusher are having this very tense moment, and during the episode, it's one of the few episodes where he and Crusher are actually at odds a lot, because she thinks that, damn the Prime Directive. It's very clear that the Breckians are taking advantage of this world. And she's like, I can come up with something that will cure them of this addiction, like right now, and just end all of this. And Picard is so strident in staying with the Prime Directive that I think this quote, and it's something that we can discuss, is very telling. So, of course, he's in the lift and he stops. He's in the turbo lift and he stops it, and he pulls Beverly to the side and he says, Beverly, the Prime Directive is not just a set of rules. It is a philosophy, and a very correct one. History has proved again and again that whenever mankind interferes with a less developed civilization, no matter how well-intentioned that interference may be, the results are invariably disastrous. And Beverly responds, it's hard to be philosophical when faced with suffering. Believe me, Beverly, Picard says, there was only one decision. And Beverly replies, I just hope that it was the right one, and Picard admits that we may never know. I think Picard's adherence to the Prime Directive, and we've talked a lot about how he uses the Prime Directive and how he employs it. On one hand, the Prime Directive is sometimes there to stop unintended interactions between species that have never met each other before, which is smart. I think if you are a human and you suddenly want to talk to the insect like Shellyak, I don't think you want that first meeting to be a random meeting. I think you want everyone to show up and be like, okay, these weird ape-like humans with their 10 fingers and 10 toes are going to talk to us, while the humans are going like, that's a fucking cockroach.
Bags, ugly bags of water, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's smart that Starfleet and the Federation have employed this philosophy. My only problem is, I think in some ways Beverly is right. I think when you have a duty and you see, I think for her, she has a duty to provide care to those in suffering. And I think when she sees that there's an obvious solution to this, the Prime Directive really does seem like a hindrance. But at the same time, I can see Picard's perspective, because what if he cured the Urnarans and the Urnarans wake up tomorrow and they're like, holy shit, these Breckians have been beating the shit out of us for centuries, keeping us hooked on this drug that we didn't need to be hooked on. The Urnarans could suddenly decide to rebuild their ships or develop them more, and the Breckians could be toast in a few years.
Well, it's interesting that you read the conversation that Picard had with Dr. Crusher on the turbo lift, because it kind of goes back to, he made a comment about something we've talked in previous episodes we've reviewed, is about the dangers of colonialism. So it gets into that. But I think the point you bring up is that, when you have a dictum like the Prime Directive, which is both a regulation and a philosophy, something I learned in my freshman year college European history is that what I got out of the whole thing was theory versus practice. This is what people wanted to do, and this is what turned out, because of, they made a plan, and as soon as you have contact with the enemy, the plan has to change, and there's unintended consequences in when you make the plan, you don't even know what those consequences might be, or the rabbit hole you go down and so forth. So I think that, what Picard did was try to balance things so that he could respect the prime directive, but also do something on a practical basis that could not immediately, but with time, change the situation. I mean,
right.
It's almost like today we're talking on the day it is April 20th, 2021. And today is, could be very important in American history in terms of our society, because it was the verdict came back from the trial of Derek Chauvin in Minnesota in regard to the murder of, or the death of George Floyd, and he was guilty on all 3 counts. And it's a sort of thing, where what Picard does, he changes the relationship between Brekka and Onara, and it's going to take time to sort out. And as he says, well, we may never come back here, so we don't know how it's going to turn out. In the same way, what happened today, it's a shift, but it's not. It's going to. There's a lot of more discussion and work needs to be done, so that situations like what happened in May of 2020 with George Floyd stop happening, because they're still happening as we speak.
Yeah. I think Picard has a very difficult choice here, in the fact that, in many ways, he's already broken the Prime Directive and interfered.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, that's where the theory and practice comes in, where Beverly's just saying, let's fix it now. But she's not looking at, well, what are the unintended consequences of that? And Picard is trying his best, and to some extent is respecting the Prime Directive, but he's kind of moving around it by changing it. And one of the notes I made is this happened before in one of the original series, where I don't remember the name of the episode, but the Enterprise shows up in this planetary system where they've been at war for years, and they've institutionalized war, and it's all projected by computers. And if your part of the city gets bombed, and you have to report to the disintegration chamber, and it's beyond. It's a very perverted version of mutual assured destruction. And Kirk shows up and says, "This is ridiculous," and he respects the Prime Directive. Well, actually, Kirk doesn't respect the Prime Directive, but kind of gets around it because he breaks the computer system that keeps this ridiculous conflict going on that's killing, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people on each planet, and forces them to say, hey, guess what? You're right. This is ridiculous. We need to make peace.
Yeah. Well, it's, I think in TOS, the original series,
right,
they weren't. I don't remember the Prime Directive really coming up a lot.
It did not. I agree. I don't think it came up as often as it didn't come up in terms of the philosophical discussion that we're seeing in Next Generation.
Oh, I found the episode that you're talking about. It's Star Trek, the original series, season 1, episode 23, A Taste of Armageddon.
Yes.
Which debuted on February 23rd, 1967. So I think that's what the episode you're referring to.
That's it.
I think on one hand, the interesting thing about the Prime Directive as it goes from captain to captain, because in Voyager, Janeway and her crew are stuck out in the Delta Quadrant all by themselves. And there are plenty of times where she openly violates the Prime Directive to get her crew past the situation or survive. I think when it comes captain to captain, or from one captain to another, Kirk's application of the Prime Directive, which is basically non-existent, is going to be automatically going to be so different from Picard's, who holds it as kind of the highest value, to, Janeway, who can't hold it as the highest value because she's in a situation where she has to break it all the time. I think the difficulty of the Prime Directive is that while philosophically it is right, and it is a right philosophy and a very correct one, as Picard notes, it really does come down to how someone applies it in the moment. So,
yes,
in one ways, Picard seems very cruel to the Onarans and the Breckians, and even to Crusher, by disallowing the Onarans to take the magnetic coils to repair their ships, which, immediately stops the Felicium trade. But on the other hand, it is kind of cruel because he's going to subject all these people to suffering, and maybe the Onarians and Breckians, as I previously mentioned, will eventually come to conflict over the trauma that the Breckians inflicted upon the Onarans intentionally, which, if they had, they don't seem to really have a legal apparatus to figure this out, which is why when Picard says the first time he sits down in the observation lounge to talk with both the Onarians and the Breckians, he's like, you have to figure this out with whatever legal mechanisms you have among yourselves.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It seems kind of obvious that, like, the Onarans and Breckians don't have a legal system to figure that out. So it makes his decision doubly difficult. Because whatever decision he makes, whether he gave them magnetic, if he gives them the magnetic coils, he's continuing the perpetuation of the Onaran suffering and the Breckians' parasitism, which is a very good word that I liked from your notes. But on the other hand, like, if he does what he ultimately decides to do, they're going to suffer anyway. So it really does turn into, that old, I think that metaphor of, if you had to choose between one person dying on a train track or 10 person dying on a train track, like, how do you measure the suffering versus... So I think in some ways the Prime Directive is, while it might be a very correct and right philosophy, it's also incredibly difficult and predicated on who's using it at the time.
I think your point about the you have to look at how a decision is made in a moment or in a specific situation that crops up. Mm-hmm. Now, just try to think of an example, and I don't know if these are good. I mean, one was, when Harry Truman knew that he had the atomic bomb and they were planning to invade the Japanese mainland. And he, put it in the scales that, well, I'm going to use the bomb because I think it'll end the war sooner and it'll save many American lives, which is his primary concern. But he may have thought that it would save a lot of Japanese lives also. I don't know.
Well, we know. So I was recently doing some research on General MacArthur and the surrender of Hirohito. Mm-hmm. When Hirohito surrendered, there was this big consideration of whether or not he should be tried as a war criminal. And there was a big investigation in terms of how involved he was with the planning of the Japanese aggression against America and in China. And there's a lot of disputed evidence about his actual participation. Some people being very, very critical, thinking that, Hirohito led this thing and he used people to get what he wanted. And then other people saying that, like, well, he was manipulated, and then there was Togo. And
I think the emperor did have responsibility because he allowed it. Whether he could have stopped it, I don't know. But of course, one thing that was realized when you bring MacArthur up, and one of the things that the Japanese wanted, they would surrender, but they didn't want to surrender. They didn't want to lose the emperor system because it was so essential to their structure of their society. And one thing that MacArthur did is understood that, but he changed things by having Hirohito come down off his godlike pedestal and getting the point across that he is a man like everybody else. The other situation.
Oh, but one thing I did want to bring up,
Sure.
This is why I started with Hirohito.
Yeah.
So I was watching this BBC documentary, and they covered the meeting Hirohito has with his generals after the bomb at Hiroshima just dropped, and then how many days was it after that Nagasaki?
3 days.
3 days later,
August 6th, August 9th, right?
After Hiroshima, they were already considering surrender, and there was a disagreement between Hirohito and I think his top general at the time, who later goes on to commit seppuku.
Right.
The general was basically like, we have 3 million troops on this island who
right.
are all willing to die and die brutally to defend it. And there was this real cultural debate of, do we serve out our cultural more, which requires that we die in battle before we suffer the dishonor of defeat or surrender, or do we take into account these weapons of mass destruction that have now been unleashed for the first time on human beings? And it's a really fascinating question about, like, how do you, Hirohito in that moment really does have to measure, like, how many more bombs can we take versus how many people can we use in invasion?
And part of the counter argument, as I understand that meeting that took place, was, look, are we going to lose another city? Tokyo could be next, and that the royal family could be destroyed.
That was the exact line.
And that's what it comes back to, that
Tokyo would be next. The
emperor system was so important to their social structure that they just could not see losing that. And I don't know if Hirohito made a decision out of fear, but that's when he said, we have to do the unthinkable.
Yeah.
That he's,
in many ways, Picard is in this, like I said before, in many ways, the decision Picard has to make in this episode is unthinkable. Because on one hand, like I said before, you're either perpetuating the economic and social slavery of the Onarans by the Breccians by giving them what they want and sending them back home, or you're continuing the suffering of the Onarans
right. And that's why I said, made the comment is, I haven't studied this, but where it's called, the title of the episode is symbiosis, but I always say it almost as parasitism, where the Breccians were just sucking the life basically out of the Onarans, and the Breccians had a pretty good existence, it seems. In the Ptolemaic decision that Picard made was going to cause a lot of suffering on both planets.
Yeah, well,
and there was no idea how they would. Who knows whether they even survived the changes that he forced on them? Really,
that's true. Well, I think one thing that this episode does is examine the difficulty of being an outsider in a long, protracted, complicated situation. And it actually made me start thinking a lot about space travel, because we tell all these stories about us going to planets and discovering new life in the forms of bacteria or animals or creatures or stuff like that. And Star Trek is really built on the idea of, like, meeting new people. Like, you're not just finding creatures out in the galaxy, you're finding civilizations. It's in the rundown of the show. Part of the Prime Directive, I think, is also to prevent something that Picard falls into by accident, because he doesn't. They're there to monitor a star in the Delos system. They're not originally there to save the Onarans from their decaying orbit. I think the worst fear that I would have if I was the captain of a starship is if I went out and I met someone new from a different civilization and all of a sudden they're like, hey, we're in the midst of this war, you want to come help? And it's just like, oh God, because are you on the right side? Are you on the wrong side? Your friend could possibly be the devil if you're not careful. So I think in many ways, like and this is where, Picard has to apply the Prime Directive his way or figure out his solution. My honest solution, like after I save those people, I'm dropping them off on their planet as quickly as I can, and I'm getting the hell out of there. As they ultimately decide to do at the end of the episode. But I wouldn't even talk to these people. I'd be like, whatever your situation is, we're out of it. We rescued you. Goodbye. Like, I'd really adhere to the Prime Directive in terms of these people we're capable.
You're talking about that once they understood the situation, just say, you know what, you guys got to figure this out. We're out of here. Yeah.
Well, ultimately, I think that's really the best decision he made. If he got any more involved, it would have spiraled.
Well, what I'm saying is, it would have been ethical or moral that once he understood, with Dr. Crusher's help, of what was going on, would have been moral to just say, I can't fix this. Bye, guys. Sorry.
You know what? That's a really great question, because on one hand, you also have Crusher saying, like, she could synthesize a cure, or she could synthesize some sort of treatment that would help the Ornarans through their withdrawal symptoms. It really becomes a question of, like, part of the Prime Directive, too, is making sure that certain technology doesn't fall into certain hands. And I wonder if there is a worry that the Anarans would take whatever medicine they were given and simply not use it correctly. Because, they've had all these centuries of being horrible drug addicts. What's the guarantee that they're not going to try to find a way to abuse whatever Crusher gives them? Because, the hard thing about drug addiction is that a lot of people who suffer from it don't really try to turn away from it until they've hit rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And usually after they've hit rock bottom multiple times. Like, there's not just one rock bottom for addicts.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very clear that in this moment, I think what Picard is seeing when he finally gets into the situation is that the Breckians and the Anarans are hitting maybe one of their first rock bottoms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think his solution is like, we just need to let these people figure it out for themselves, which, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I think ultimately serves. I do worry about the entire, like, we may never know the outcome since we may not be back here for a long time. But, like, these people are out here. You know that they have ships. You now know that there's a civilization out there. Is Starfleet going to just cover up this planet or Brekka or Onara and act like they don't exist?
Yeah, that might be a weakness of the story, because they could definitely send a survey ship or a science ship by in a couple of years to see whether they had. Yeah.
Or what if another Starfleet vessel accidentally runs into the Onarans or the Breckons? Picard accidentally runs into the Onarans in this episode. What stops another ship from doing the same thing? It turns into this thing where, he has already interacted with them. Starfleet has already interfered with their culture in a way.
Why doesn't the Federation just have robotic ships that can go check on things?
That's a great question. And the truth is, as we in the real world progress in space exploration, one of the big milestones, and Ben, I hope you're listening to this, one of the big milestones we had recently is that we have now flown a small helicopter on the surface in the atmosphere or sky of Mars, which is that really is the future of space exploration until we figure out some way to actually get humans from point A to point B.
Because maybe back in the 60s and even the 90s, there wasn't, good thinking or planning about how, everything was thought about, well, we need to send humans out to Mars and Jupiter and so forth, rather than just using, robotic ships. And, we probably should have thought about that or talked about that more. Maybe it was, because what the heck was Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 and some of the other probes that went to Saturn and Mars and the outer planets?
Yeah. So, well, I think, there's already talk about constructing entire drone armies.
Oh, sure.
I use the word army, but drone army. Let's just stick with that. There's already talk of if we want to find life on Europa, we send a drone there. We don't send humans, because you want to send a rover or something down there to break the ice, see what's in the water down there. You don't want a human to go down there and actually do it first, because what if a creature reaches up and tears that human down into the water? At least with the rover, we would be like, oh, okay, there's something there under the ice. And at the same time, it would be, I think sending a drone would be good in terms of not contracting some sort of interstellar diseases. Because, one thing that they're constantly running into in Star Trek are new diseases and plagues, viruses that humans have never run into before. Sending drones out there, hopefully with the idea that these drones are probably not coming back, kind of does away with the worry of that, of being contaminated by some unknown pathogen. So there really are a lot of benefits. Oh, here's a big one. There is a theory that while we may not be able to send ourselves or a large starship into faster than light travel, we might be able to create drones small enough that we are able to launch them at near light speeds towards a destination.
I think I've read something about that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. There's just so many different opportunities and things that we can use in terms of drone technology to explore space that, along with, I think, I don't want to use interstellar travel, travel among the solar system, which I think is going to be something in the near future. I would imagine that we would be employing more. I think that if we reach the point where we're able to, let's say if we're able to get to Saturn, by the time we get there, I actually think that we will send drones to do most of the construction and most of the hard manual labor before we get there. For example, take Mars. If we settled Mars, one of the things that we probably have to do to make it sustainable is terraform it. Well, you can't really send humans at the moment to terraform Mars, but you could probably get a head start by sending a whole bunch of drones to go out there and plant seeds. There's talks of firing nukes into the atmosphere of Mars to melt the ice water and somehow kind of restart the atmosphere. There's a lot of things that you could do ahead of time that would never require human hands, to the point when an actual human explorer first steps down on Mars or Europa or even Venus. We often don't talk about Venus, but Venus also exists in this Goldilocks zone of habitable planets. I think by the time we actually set foot on a planet in the solar system that's not Earth, a lot of the work getting there will have been done by AI-controlled drones that we sent there first, maybe centuries beforehand. So, the closest Earth-like planet, I think, is around Proxima Centauri A. And apparently...
Is that 4.5 light years? Something like that?
Yeah. And at current speeds, I think the last thing I read, we could make it there in under 300 years. But that would require something called a generation ship.
Yes,
or an interstellar arc. where you'd have multiple generations of people living and dying on the ship before the hopefully surviving crew.
Yes, right.
But unless we figure out some sort of faster than light travel, that might actually be the future of interstellar exploration. It might take us 1,000 years to colonize the galaxy, but in that 1,000 years time, we will have already kind of planted the mechanical seeds of our expansion in all these different worlds, which kind of fits into something, I've mentioned kind of every episode now that I'm watching The Expanse. One thing that they're discovering in The Expanse is that this alien race that tried to connect the galaxy through this series of wormholes, they did it by seeding these wormholes by setting this thing called a protomolecule, which is not actually an organism. It's a program for pattern replication. So you send the protomolecule to a planet, and it will adapt and study the life around it. And from that, it will make a determination that, okay, there's a sentient life here that should probably be allowed to join the galaxy in some way from the original quote-unquote ring builders. And what the ring builders is that they set out this kind of biomechanical structure, kind of a drone, to prepare the way for them. And what the drone does actually is it lands on Venus, and using the resources of Venus, it actually builds a ring structure that gets sent out into space. And when that ring structure is fully formed, the wormhole initiates. So, you're now looking at a civilization that had that plan, at least in The Expanse, an ancient civilization that had the plan to seed their travel to Earth, but long before they actually made it there. So I actually think that that's a real possibility of where we head to. But a lot of it is also predicated on us surviving climate change and reversing that. Not wiping ourselves out, here on Earth. And one thing that The Expanse talks about is, they have colonized Mars, and they've colonized the asteroid belt and some parts of the outer planets. We have to make sure we don't wipe ourselves out in an intersystem conflict. So there, as hopeful as we are for our ability to explore space, we also need to realize that there's a lot of hurdles we need to get through. And part of that is what Star Trek explores. It's a human race that has gotten past those hurdles.
That's right.
So, I think we've had a really good discussion, but the two things. So it seems like both the Anarans and the Breckians have a bioelectric defense mechanism akin to an electric eel. In terms of a similar phenomenon that exists in our natural universe. What did you make of this? And as a biologist, what do you think was going on there? Because they bring this up and it's used one or two times, especially in a hostage situation with Riker. But Riker and Yar discuss it as something like, I wonder how they evolved to have that. But then they kind of dropped it. Do you have any speculation on how they may have gotten there?
If on their worlds, if they had, if they evolved from lower species over millions of years, they may have had some animal that had that capability, as we know that electric eels do. And as they evolved, the genes that promoted that to allow that may have just become part of their genome, if that would be possible.
Well, one beautiful thing about the story of us and humanity is how we actually came to be as a species. We didn't just start out as primates. Those primates came from smaller mammals, and those mammals were evolved from reptiles that evolved from fishes that crawled out of the sea. The idea of like a humanoid species evolving from a animal that could possess a bioelectric kind of defense system is not that far-fetched. The other idea that I had possibly was that there's something in the Breccian or Anaran atmosphere involved with their central star that they're orbiting around. This is kind of the Superman theory. So Superman gets his powers because on Krypton, their sun was relatively old and weak, so the radiation from it didn't provide the nutrients to Kal-El or Clark Kent's cell structure. But when he gets to Earth, the radiation from Sol actually nourishes his cells to the point where he can break the hold of gravity, which is why Superman can fly, but he can also, all the Superman powers. I think something like that similarly could have probably happened to the Narns and Breckons. I think it might be something specialized to their own system. That, this might be the only part where you're going to find a humanoid-like species that looks like us. They have a nose ridge. But their power to use this bioelectric defense may truly be unique to them and them alone. And I think in terms of exobiology, which this show explores a lot, I think that's a very fascinating thing to look at. And I wish, again, we talk about the world building in this episode, I wish they had done a little bit more with it. Finally, the show ends with Picard saying, Picard and the rest of the crew are kind of exasperated from everything. And let me see if I can actually get the quote, because, so Picard walks on the bridge and Riker asks him, "Destination, sir?" And Picard's like, "I don't care. Just get us out of here. Let's get some distance between us and this system." And Geordi's like, "All right, course 970, Mark 38, speed warp 3. Where will that take us, Mr. LaForge?" Riker asks. "The Opperline system. Interesting choice. Why?" "Curiosity," says Geordi. "You've never been there."
That's right, yeah.
I think in some ways this is an interesting way to end this episode. Because on one hand, they've just done some exploration.
They had an experience that they did not expect to have.
Yeah, but it wasn't enjoyable.
Right. So they're going to go somewhere else, and they could have a similar, somewhat negative experience since they've never been there before. Right.
But I do find kind of the intrepidness of the crew in their, and I think it's the beauty of Roddenberry's vision, really. The fact that even after going through this kind of demoralizing moment, Geordi can still find a way to perk up everyone, saying like, "Hey guys, remember what we're doing out here? We're exploring and trying to make ourselves better. So let's get back to that." And everyone gets back to it. And I think it's a wonderful way to end the episode.
It is. It was. Oh yeah, I made a note of that too.
So just to close up, where do you put this episode in terms of this season? Do you think it's one of the better episodes, one of the more middling episodes?
I think it's kind of one of the weaker episodes because of the gaps that we've identified in the story. It's a good story once you get into it, but what we've talked about is, well, how do these worlds get there? And how do they maintain this? And how do they maintain the ships? I mean, this is the first episode that we've really kind of picked apart and found some weaknesses in the background story that allows the story to play out.
I think one thing that struck me before we were originally going to try to record this yesterday, but children wear you out. One thing that I before we were going to sit down, I actually watched the episode again for a second time, because after watching it for the first time, I completely forgot about it. And yesterday when I was like, "Oh, we're filming Symbiosis tonight," I literally had a moment where I was like, I have no clue what happened in this episode. I think you're right. I think it's one of the weaker episodes, and in many ways, I think it's one of the more forgettable ones. Not just because I forgot it, but I really do think that it's good in terms of message, but it's not very dense in terms of story.
Right. Yeah.
And
I like the adjective dense. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the good Star Trek episodes are the ones that are not only dense in terms of storytelling, but are also, also contain kind of easier narratives to follow. And in some ways, like this episode's all over the place. Even like we had a hostage situation with Riker where they threatened to kill him, and then like literally a minute later, Riker's like, "Well, I'm okay." It's just a very up and down episode.
Right.
So,
well, the next one's not going to be is not going to be dense. It's going to be a really good one.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to next episode. We are going to be looking at Skin of Evil, and we're going to have great big discussions about Tasha Yar. But
yes,
that will be for next time.
Yes.
Dad, thank you for joining me for another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. And
thanks, Jay.
We will see everyone next time for Skin of Evil, Star Trek episode, The Next Generation, episode 1. Season 1, episode 23. Until then, everyone have a great night.
Thanks, Jay. Bye-bye.